All
Mhm.
right. I'm here today with Warren Zenna, founder of the CRO Collective and Zenna Consulting, to talk all things revenue leadership, revenue strategy, and revenue operations. Warren, thank you for joining me today.
Eddie, thanks for having me. Good. Looking forward to this conversation a lot.
Me too. I think we've got some exciting things to go over. But first, what I want to do is I want to give our audience a background. If you could quickly go through sort of your history, your career history, what you've done, and what you're doing today between your two companies.
Sure. So, I have been in sales and marketing. I guess those two kind of disciplines for since '94, right? So I started selling mostly the publishing side of the business, selling advertising, traditional advertising, and then I rose up the ranks selling digital marketing, as we call it, or for now it's probably it's more traditional at this point. But selling a search, right? Selling online advertising, selling creative services, working for boutique companies, all in the technology sector. I either worked in B2B, selling B2B services, or for a lot of my career, I worked in the agency world. So I was at Publicis for a number of years as an executive there, selling mobile consulting, and then I had my own agency for a bit, and then I was at Havas for about 4 years as an EVP. I had a P&L, and I ran a mobile advertising unit there. So I've got a very interesting kind of mix under my belt because I sold marketing, I was selling services, and then I became a buyer. So a bit of an interesting 360-degree understanding of the entire B2B ecosystem of how each player kind of plays with each other within that economy. And it afforded me a really good perspective on how to build these various businesses that I have right now.
That's great. So tell me a little bit more about what you're doing in each of your companies today and where your focus is.
Sure. So the Zenna Consulting Group is essentially a marketing consultancy. And I use the word consultancy because it's important that we're not an agency. And the reason is because I think the agency model has some flaws. So what we do is we work more as a very specialized organization to help B2B companies and B2C companies, frankly, understand how to develop their growth marketing and demand gen, right? So we work on a lot of organic-based marketing, content development, content marketing, search engine optimization, and the disciplinary focus on comms and how all that stuff all works together. I mean, it's a very unique way in which we pull a lot of various disciplines together to create outcomes for brands aside from paid advertising. And, we're advocates of paid advertising, but as you probably can appreciate, paid advertising gets a lot of love, and I'm sorry, let me turn this. And what ends up happening is we find that the organic part of the business is kind of thrown off to more technical people. And it's so critical today, really good organic marketing. So we have a really nice stable of clients. We do that. So then the other side is the CRO Collective, which has been my focus for about a year and a half now. And what I do with that business is focus specifically on chief revenue officers, right? So there's really no support system for chief revenue officers, which is a really kind of fascinating fact. And B2B companies tend to appoint chief revenue officers incorrectly, which creates a lot of problems for companies. And so the CRO Collective kind of mission is to kind of realign the way that B2B companies look at their revenue operations, to build more aligned revenue functions and hire CROs properly, and also make sure their CROs succeed, because the chief revenue officer is likely going to be one of the most expensive hires that a company makes. Not only that, but it's also a role that has such huge implications for the growth of the organization that if it's not done correctly, it can be really risky. So I work with CROs, I work with aspiring CROs, people who want to become CROs, and I work with chief executive officers who are looking to build organizations that are going to scale, and they're looking to hire a chief revenue officer. And my organization helps support that process. And I have courses, and I have a consultancy that works specifically with companies to build out what I call CRO-ready organizations.
Yeah, and I'm excited to dive into that and talk about how that relates to strategy, analytics, revenue operations, et cetera. But to put things in context, who's your ideal customer for those companies? What size of organizations are you working with in general?
Got it. On the Zenna Consulting Group side, which is the kind of marketing consultancy, we have some pretty big clients. I mean, we can work with clients as we can work with $1 billion revenue clients, or if we wanted to. We have a very strong expertise and we oversee some pretty big strategic efforts. Most of our clients are probably in the 50 to 200 million in revenues businesses. We're taking on, basically we're taking over their entire growth marketing efforts. So any company that's looking to scale either locally or nationally. And then on the CRO collective, it's a bit more nuanced, right? So there's 3 cohorts there. So my ideal customer are heads of sales or heads of like sales leaders who have aspirations to become a chief revenue officer. I have a course for those leaders who want to understand better how to make that jump from the VP or the management suite into the C-suite and become a chief revenue officer. And then there's the CRO, right? And usually the best customers for me on the CRO side are first-time CROs, like CROs whom it's their first role. They're probably in the role for 3 to 6 months, and they're experiencing all of the pains that come with being in that role for the first time, and usually under conditions where the company didn't really properly appoint them, and they're experiencing a lot of the. This is actually a big issue for a lot of chief revenue officers, and I work
so
with
it's
them.
their first. It's their first time as a CRO.
And, that's right. Most of the time, yeah. Most of the time.
And the first CRO for the company too, it sounds like.
That's right. That's right. So it's really niche, right? So we can get into this more when we talk, but the CRO role is it's a really nebulous role, and someone who never was a CRO before and in their first CRO role and they're at a company that's hiring a CRO for the first time, there's just so many issues that plague that particular relationship that my clients sit inside of that situation. Like I can help recalibrate both the company and that person to be successful. And then the last would be the CEO of a B2B company that hasn't hired a CRO yet. So usually it's between like 10 and 25 million or so in revenues. I mean, it's sort of, kind of guessing it a bit because there isn't really a science to this, but it really is a company that's at a point where they probably have a head of sales, they probably have a head of marketing, they probably have a head of customer success, but they really haven't really looked for a CRO yet. They're looking for one. They believe that a chief revenue officer will bring a lot more expertise and scale to their business. And they're about to make, in my, kind of experience, a couple of mistakes that my program will help that CEO better understand what a CRO does, how to find the right one, how to appoint one properly. But really more importantly, Eddie, it's how to make their company CRO ready so that their organization is actually set up for a CRO to succeed. And this is really important. So that's like kind of like that's like the real or bigger opportunity where the CRO collective can impact, because that's a critical part of the growth of a company. So that's kind of where I'm working to strive to gain traction in the business.
So let's get into this because you've already got my interest here. So we're talking companies with 10 to 25 million in revenue. I assume a lot of these are venture capital backed, high growth.
That's right. Almost all.
And you,
yes.
And you think that that's what you see is that's the most common company that is making that conversion from having distinct heads of sales, marketing, and service to having a CRO?
I do, and there's a lot of reasons for it, right? There isn't some science. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's a lot or enough of a framework or a roadmap out there that all CEOs are kind of looking at. Like, for example, I would imagine, I don't think this is probably something that's been documented, but it makes sense that when a B2B company is looking to hire, let's say, a CFO, right? Or even promote their marketing person to a CMO, there's a bit more consistency with which a CEO looks and evaluates those people, because the functions that those two roles I just referenced provide are very clear. I mean, you know what a CFO does, right? I mean, there might be little tweaks to it, but for the most part, you know what a CFO does. Certainly, you know what a CMO does, right? A CMO oversees marketing, right? A CRO, however, there's a lot of ambiguity about what that is. Now, the majority of CEOs usually look at a CRO as someone who's going to run sales. Right? That's really the perception, is I'm going to bring in an executive who will oversee my sales organization, but more from a strategic or a leadership perspective, and bring maybe a Rolodex and some influence, and also bring a little bit more strategic thinking to the sales operation, right? Now you're
segueing into this question that I really wanted to ask, which is what is the difference between a CRO and a VP of sales? It sounds like, in your opinion, it's a lot more complex than saying, okay, this person's not just running sales, but also marketing and service.
No question. It's a lot more complex. And I don't know if this is entirely just an opinion. I would say there's a lot of data to back up the fact that when a company hires a CRO, as a more like complex revenue leader, as opposed to hiring a CRO to be a sales leader, they have more success with that particular board. And here's why, right? So, and let's talk a little bit first about, like you mentioned, a couple of things. So you've got a company that's looking for a chief revenue officer for various reasons. Now, sometimes they're not looking for a chief revenue officer for the right reasons. Many times the CEO is looking for a CRO, not because they see a CRO as being a necessary component to their business, but more because there's some degree to which I think companies feel like having a CRO is a sign that they've matured, right? It's like almost, and I don't want to sound glib, it's almost like a couple that, kind of feels the need to have to buy a house at some point, right? It kind of
Well, I think one of these major milestones in building a business is building out an executive team, right?
I agree.
So,
exactly, 100%. And so the CRO role sits in that sort of, bucket of check boxes. And if I have a chief revenue officer, it sort of signifies that I've matured my organization in some respect. And it's probably true, but it's not any deeper than that, right? I don't know, because I speak to a lot of CEOs about this, and when I dig into it, I'm surprised at how, and I mean this respectfully, how little depth is put into what the CRO role means and why they're doing it. And most of the time, there's a couple of reasons, right? So one is, let's say it's a company that has a really, really good sales leader that's really doing well and running the sales organization. And that VP of sales or that SVP of sales or that head of sales has sort of reached we'll call it like a succession plateau. Like there's no level left for that person to go to except continuing to run sales. So they throw that person a CRO title as a means to kind of give them a promotion and give them more executive authority. But they keep the focus of their business the same. So they haven't really changed the person's role so much as they've just given them a different title, right?
So they're really a CRO in name only.
100%. And so I meet a lot of chief revenue officers whom, they're great. They're really talented and they're incredible sales leaders and they're CROs, and they sort of were given this promotion because, it happens, right? Especially today with the amount of opportunities there are in the marketplace, a CRO can, get promoted because he threatens to leave or she threatens to leave. And so the CEO says, I'm going to keep you around, so I'll make you chief revenue officer and, give you a little bit more bump in salary and maybe some equity. And it sort of satisfies this need for successive planning, but it doesn't really change the role at all. And what happens is a lot of cultural and organizational implications to that decision that a lot of CEOs don't think about. So that's one reason why it happens. The other one is that there's some thought going into this, right? Because if you probably do a search right now on LinkedIn for chief revenue officer in the job section, there are a lot more chief revenue officer roles out there now than I've ever seen. And I think that shows that there's some obviously a thought going on that these companies feel the need to have a chief revenue officer. And if you read all the job descriptions, which I do, I read them daily, they all seem to indicate something consistent, which is the company's reached this level of maturity or complexity that the CEO or leadership believes that a chief revenue officer needs to come in to kind of bring a little bit more order and strategic thinking to their sales operation, right? And if you look at the descriptions, it's very much centered around that. Now, to your question, what a CRO really should be doing, the most effective way to bring one on is to have a CRO come in and oversee the entire revenue function. So it really is truly a chief revenue officer. What I mean that is really overseeing marketing, overseeing sales, and overseeing customer success. As a holistic revenue organization, which you and I will probably talk about this, where revenue operations becomes a critical component of how those three organizations are managed, right? And when a CRO is brought in to do those things, as you could probably even hear in the way I'm describing it, that's a different type of person, right? It's not someone who just understands how to run sales organizations, which, by the way, that's a difficult thing to do. Doing it really well is an incredibly good skill. But then understanding how sales and marketing and customer success work together and how the three of those organizations actually build a true revenue operation, that's a much different sort of perspective. And a CRO has to have different qualities and different competencies to be able to do that really effectively. So sort of what I'm trying to do is get a CEO to understand that and the benefits of that and why having a CRO function that way will have much greater positive impact in the organization than having one just oversee sales. That's sort of the way I'm trying to focus on impacting companies.
Well, let's drill into this a little bit. So I think you said order and strategic operations, if I caught that right?
Yeah.
So help me understand that better. You've got a VP of sales that gets promoted to a CRO or that has a CRO come in above them. Mm-hmm. What is the difference, especially in terms of sales, between a normal VP of sales and somebody that brings more order and strategic operations to the mix?
Yeah. So if you think about the revenue functions, let's think about the three I just mentioned. Think about sales, think about marketing, and customer success, right? These are three distinct disciplines that reside within a revenue operation. And they each have very specific competencies, right? Someone who's really good at marketing, if they're really good at it, they have a very specific type of skills. They're data-driven, right? Very analytically driven, and in many cases also really good at messaging and product marketing, et cetera. And those are distinct competencies from someone who's really good at selling and building sales pipelines and sales organizations. So what ends up happening is, if you look at I call it, I'm going to use the word immature revenue operation, you've got a lot of silos. So it's very common, it's probably pervasive, I think it's a disease, frankly, that a lot of companies, before they reach this plateau and they've made this switch, they've got sales, marketing, and customer success organizations operating in distinct silos, and they're usually not coordinated and they're misaligned. They're not really working together. Right? You hear this all the time. You hear the big, sales and marketing conflict, right? There's like articles written about this every week. There's software that's designed to help this. There's consultancies that are trying to solve the sales and marketing conundrum. And the complaints are, we all heard them before, marketing think that salespeople are just all swagger and all they do is just, run around and take people out to lunch. And salespeople think marketing people just all talk a lot. They just run numbers and they're all, it's all vaporware. And they're both wrong, right? I mean, we know that marketing contributes a great deal of value to a company, and we know that sales is really difficult. But this perception, it's pervasive. It doesn't stop. And as a result, they don't work well together. So what ends up happening is
we see this a lot.
Yeah,
on our
exactly.
end as well.
I'm sure, right? It's a major problem, okay? And in your world, what happens is people try and solve it through software. This is a really big issue, okay? So, they'll go get Salesforce or Gong or, any of the other, platforms, which are all good platforms, obviously, but they're really designed to kind of symptomatically fix something that's going on within their company. And what I think they tend to overlook is the company's just not set up properly from a leadership and organizational perspective, right? So what's happening is you've got marketing that is being measured on their specific KPIs, right? That are designed to provide a way for the organization to determine how much marketing is contributing to the bottom line, right? How many leads have you gotten us, right? How many qualified leads have you gotten us? How are they converting? And what's the quality of the leads that marketing is able to bring into the organization? So when sales gets them, they can say, well, thank you, marketing. Those were really warm and they really helped us a lot. That's, as you know.
Well, and that's assuming that they can even track that far down the funnel, right?
And they can't. That's very difficult to do. So again, I'm really talking right now about organizational or dynamics because it's important that we talk about this perspective before we get into the weeds. Because now if I'm running marketing in that scenario that I just described, as you can appreciate, right, my survival is going to be predicated on my ability to prove the value of the budget that I've been given towards the bottom line. And I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that the company is aware that my contribution is valid and it's measurable. And it's really hard to do, right? Oops, I don't know what's going on there. I'm sorry about this. I could fix that.
Oh, no worries.
Oh, I think
I'm not even looking at the screen because then I'll be looking down the whole time.
Don't worry about it. I fixed it. Sorry about that. So I'll continue. So what you have then there is you have a problem, right? Where you've got marketing that is essentially motivated to try and attribute more credit for what they're doing than motivated to help sales. And it's not because they're bad people. It's just that they're being measured incorrectly, right? So you're creating
not just measured, but they're being compensated incorrectly.
Exactly.
They're being incentivized. They're being promoted, recognized, 100%. Rewarded.
Exactly. It's all that stuff comes out of this. Okay. And so sales is the same way. Okay. Marketing is not the only culprit here. Sales is more likely to say, marketing didn't help me with this. I got this on my own. I got this lead, or, I converted that lead, or that lead that came in was totally cold. It was useless, but I changed that person's mind, or I won that customer over. And boy, I'm glad sales is here to make these crappy marketing leads really worth something. And that's probably not true all the time either, right? And so right away, what I'm describing here is something that a CEO is constantly dealing with. And so what they tend to do is they tend to try and fix these problems symptomatically, right? So they'll go and they'll say something like, we have a real problem with marketing. They seem to be really, difficult to support sales, or with sales is really difficult, in terms of their ability to support marketing. And they look at each one of these different functions, and they'll maybe go to the head of marketing or the head of sales and say, you got to fix this. This isn't working. What they tend not to realize is that there isn't any oversight, like executive oversight, whose job it is to sort of create systems, right, in place where these organizations are working together differently, like completely change the way
revenue
that they're
operations.
Exactly, revenue operations. So a CRO who's well appointed, right, is the right competencies and skills, will oversee these three organizations. I say three because there's also customer success, which we haven't even mentioned. It's a really big part of this. As a matter of fact, I'd say, frankly, it could be the most important one for reasons we'll get into. But a really good CRO won't just oversee sales, because you can see how that would only exacerbate the problems I just referenced earlier, right? But if I put an executive now in charge of one of those functions, it's going to make that function's problems even more, more pronounced. So the CRO really, optimally, and this is what I advise my clients to do, is have the CRO oversee sales and marketing and customer success. As a matter of fact, the optimal org chart would look like a CRO has someone who oversees sales report into him or her, someone who oversees marketing report into him or her, and someone who oversees customer success report into him or her. And the three of them, right, are representative leaders of those three functions, but they are a team. Like, those three actually work in coordination with each other, with the oversight of the chief revenue officer, who kind of recalibrates the way in which these three organizations work together, so that that divisiveness and those kind of cross-purpose KPIs are removed, so that it's easier to understand how they contribute with each other. And it's through systems and processes and different ways in which things are measured. And so by doing so, they remove that friction, and you get better outcomes from those three organizations. And they're really a team now. Like, they're actually incentivized to work together because it benefits each one of them for the others to get credit for what they're doing, right? Whereas in the scenario I referenced earlier, that's not the case.
Yeah,
right? It's almost like
absolutely.
divisive. And so,
I think that one thing that's really interesting is when we drill into, customer success, that's not just customer service, right? That's account management, that's renewals, that's everything it takes to, keep and grow customers. And when you're thinking about revenue targets and you're sitting down with the CEO of the organization and talking about what you want to achieve in 2022, for example, how do you do that if you don't have clear visibility into how many customers you're going to win, how many customers you're going to keep, to what extent you're going to grow them? Right?
Yep, exactly. So if you look at a CRO function, I just mentioned one, right? So the first CRO function, and it's not the only one, is to first build this sort of revenue operation that's more aligned, right? And reconfigure the way it's set up so that these organizations are working together. And all the respective aspects of that are designed for that, right? So the operational, the analytics, the measurement, the attribution, the technologies are all designed so that on a week-to-week or day-to-day basis, those three functions have no choice but to sit down together and collaborate on how they're going to get the job done, because their goals are intricately designed. I refer to it this way, and it can be a little bit sort of, I don't know, it's a bit of a strange way of doing it, but it just makes a lot of sense. So when you have a couple and they're dating, and then they end up living together and they get married, for a good period of time, their focus and the context of that relationship is very predicated on their needs, right? They can take vacations whenever they want. They can live wherever they want. They can eat kind of food wherever they want. They can live anywhere they want. And it tends to look that way. But once they have kids, all of a sudden the context of the entire organization, we'll call it, changes. Because now the kids become the focus. And the decisions that both those two grown-ups make have to take into account how it impacts the children, right? So they change the way they eat, they change where they live, they change the kind of context of their life, they change the way they travel. And I look at it much like this. And I think that, in a way, it's a maturation of the organization. That, when you finally have, I'm going to call it like almost like a parental, right, a entity that oversees these three organizations, the context of the entire organization changes, right? Because now the outcomes are more collective. Everyone's thinking about the same outcome, which is frankly the customer, right? The customer really is, in this, the child in the analogy I'm saying here. Because the customer's experience and the customer's outcomes and the lifetime value of the customer, the long-term value of the customer, and the value that we're delivering to the customer should really be the main metric that everyone's looking at to determine outcomes, right? And
well, let's drill into this for a second, right? Okay. So think about it this way. you've got a company that's extremely early stage, right? And they hire their first sales guy or first sales gal, their second salesperson. Okay, they hire a marketer, they hire somebody in customer support, and let's go pre-COVID. Very real chance that these folks are literally sitting 2 feet away from each other, right? So it's not so difficult for the salesperson to turn over and say, "Hey, Tom, we just signed this client. I hope you can take care of them. Let me know if you have any questions," and have this like natural collaboration. But as the organization matures, you would think so, right?
You'd think so.
Me experiencing this firsthand, I've worked in a few companies that had less than 10 employees, right? And so it wasn't that difficult for us to collaborate across sales, service, and marketing.
Sure,
but what happens?
The distance between the people, both organizationally and physically, made it easier for that collaboration to take place. There's no question about that. Yes.
And the tech or lack thereof. But then what happens is you grow the sales team, you grow the sales tech, you grow the marketing team, you grow the marketing tech. And these are in these silos. And then you eventually get to this point where it's like, wow, we've got 10 salespeople, maybe different types of salespeople, and a number of marketers and a number of customer success people. And we don't have a shared system to communicate. We don't have shared data. We're not physically sitting next to each other as much as we were in the beginning. There's not as much collaboration because salespeople are talking to salespeople now that they have a team rather than the one salesperson talking to the one marketer and the one customer support person. And so then you're coming in, or the CRO is coming in and saying, we need to break these silos down. We need to have a shared, we need to have shared tech, shared data, and a shared process and a shared strategy.
And a shared purpose. And I don't mean to sound like, more like highfalutin here. And I don't mean like purpose, like, we're saving the world. But purpose, and the best purpose is, what's the customer outcome? So we have a product, we have something we're solving for people, right? I don't know, whatever that is, right? Even if it's a, commoditized ad tech platform, doesn't matter. There's still value that someone's getting from purchasing it. And that customer's outcome, that customer success, that customer value, the lifetime value should be the sort of North Star for all three of these organizations to be looking at, because ultimately everyone knows that if that customer continues to be happy and continues to have a good experience and continues to purchase, that's going to be an outcome that we should be looking at and try to repeat, right? And so I think that's missing, right? And so what you mentioned before is great. I really appreciate that little kind of way that you just told that little sort of, growth tale, because there's a couple of parts of that. I agree with you that there's, tech that's added and that there's other systems that are added and other things. But the reality is that most of the way in which those, in the early stages of the organization, why that fragmentation exists is not as much as it is complexity and adding more people. It's really what happens is that once organizations start to add more people to different groups, they just, without realizing it, they start to silo them in the way that they're managed. Because we just do this, right? Companies are working off old blueprints. They look at like, oh, we got to manage our sales organization. We have to set up our sales process. We have to set up our marketing process. And as soon as you create a sales or marketing process, you already created two distinct processes for two distinct groups that need to be really actually together, right? And so it's an outcome of the way in which organizations are built. And there's a flaw in it. And what ends up happening is a CRO sort of has a tough job to come in. This is why the CRO has to have very specific skill sets to be able to do something, because to come into organizations that aren't working together, that's a really specific type of person that knows not only operationally, organizationally, functionally, knows how to like distinguish these things, but also knows how to create order in chaos, right? And so the other factor that I think is really critical to bring up here, which we really didn't get into, is the financial factor, right? So as you already mentioned, and you're correct, the majority of the companies that we're talking about today are funded by third parties, whether VC or PE or whatever. So if I'm a CEO of this company and I'm receiving money in a funding round, whether it's a seed or even an A round, that investment comes with expectations, right? And it comes with other types of there are expectations is the best word, right? So expectations and outcomes that are required for that money. So now the CEO who's received those funds is in a really tough pickle, because many times to satisfy the requirements of that funding are in conflict with satisfying the needs of the customer. Okay, we see this a lot. And so as a result, the CEO has got a difficult job because the CEO has to satisfy the board and satisfy the need for additional funding at the expense of the best customer experience, right? And so this dynamic drives a lot of the decisions that are being made today. This is why you and I are in business in a way, because what's happening right now is automation and programmatic delivery of both advertising and services and self-serve businesses. They're creating this onslaught of ways in which customers are being serviced, which in many ways is counter to the way customers really want to be serviced.
Could you give some examples from what you're seeing?
Sure. So for example, I think one thing that we all would agree with, right, is I'm overloaded right now with inbound. Like I'm sure you are, right? I every day I can't believe the amount of inbound I get. I get through my LinkedIn and my email alone. I probably receive, it could be between 50 and 100 inbound requests from some entity or another, assuming that they've made some assessment of me based on whatever demographic or psychographic information that they've got about me.
I get a lot of inbound too, but I'm increasingly setting up walls to prevent that. So on LinkedIn,
but you still have to, right? You're forced to have to set up a wall because the fact is it's still coming at you, and this is a symptom. This is a symptom of the problem I'm referring to, right? Because
and I think the point I'm trying to make here is that me putting up those walls says something about what's happening in the market.
100%.
On LinkedIn, I don't accept personalized invitations anymore because I've found that there's an extremely high correlation with getting spam immediately after accepting that request.
Most people feel that way.
On email, I'm increasingly unsubscribing to just almost everything. And the exception is that there's a few people that are doing it right where I'm excited to see their post on LinkedIn and I'm excited to see their email because they're sharing relevant content and not just smashing me with spam.
100%. So you're pointing to the great distinction. I'm really frustrated about this. I apologize. I know what's going on. I can fix it, but it's you have to do it anyway.
No worries.
So what I'm saying is this is and your point is great because what's happening is you and I are both potential customers for somebody. We're probably potential customers for dozens of people, right? But software companies or other types of automated solutions or marketing services solutions, data-driven solutions. But because of the way in which we're being marketed to, right, we're not even able to qualify these offerings because we're already annoyed before we even have an opportunity to dig into whatever it is they're offering us because the nature of how they're reaching us is counterproductive. What's driving that? Like, why is it, right?
Metrics.
It's metrics. It's because people need to fill their pipelines and people need to fill their qualified leads and marketing needs to justify, the budgets that they're being paid or they want to, make their whatever. And these are all unfortunate outcomes of the ways in which these organizations are being managed. So the symptoms that you and I are, I'm trying to fix this through better management, better leadership so that these things sort of become looked at a bit differently. And I think that's not an easy task, but that's what I'm trying to accomplish here.
So I want to try to pivot this, and I want to do my best to take everything you just said and pivot together. But when you look at an organization, let's focus in on these like $10 to $25 million in revenue. They're bringing in a CRO. Maybe they brought one in. Maybe they haven't yet. They're somewhere in that trajectory. When you're talking to a funded B2B SaaS company with $10 to $25 million in revenue, at what point in time do you think that they should be bringing in revenue operations and why?
So if I'm hearing your description correctly, I would say that I don't have a number in mind. Like I can't say that like, well, you have to be this much.
No,
revenue,
right?
I'm
not asking that.
There's no way to know that answer, but there are some symptomatic or let's call them qualities or characteristics that I think there's a point at which those things are indicators. And one of them is, I'd say, complexity. Okay, so like you said, right, that earlier stage where I've just got like a guy selling and someone doing some decks, you don't need anything like this. I've seen people hire CROs day one. I don't get it. To me, it's a vanity position. It's probably they're trying to just get somebody to say yes to come work for me. But we really need someone to really oversee a revenue operation is when there's a revenue operation to oversee. I don't want to sound glib, but what I mean is there needs to be a sales organization where you've got at least 3 or 5 salespeople, where a process is in place, right? Where there's a playbook that you've developed, or there's an outreach process that you're working off of, and you've got a customer identified, right? And you have revenues in place that you can try and repeat, right? And there has to be enough of that there's a sales leader whom is managing what is obviously growing to become a more complex, nuanced sales effort, right? And then similarly, I would say that there needs to be a marketing organization. And that doesn't mean some big, huge marketing organization. I mean, like I just said, there has to be some understanding of who the customer is, what our marketing channels are, budgets have been allocated, right? The proper channels have been determined. There's budget being invested in those channels. There's metrics that are coming out of those channels, right? This is like, there's some complexity there that is probably already moving in a direction you could tell is probably already going a little bit off the rails. And then lastly, there needs to be an account group, right? Where there's people who are onboarding customers, managing customers, right? And making some sense of customer outcomes. And that doesn't have to be pretty big. I mean, that can be, again, I don't, there's no like sort of formula for this, but I would say as a CEO, I should be able to look at my organization and think, I've got a sales force. I've got a marketing function. I've got a customer success organization. That's the point at which an audit is probably a good idea to understand what type of animal have I created here? What are some of the things that I'm not seeing? What are some of the ways in which I've already set these 3 functions up to start sort of not working well together? What are the
so I like this, and I want to drill in.
right?
I want to drill in here.
Right.
Let's drill into this audit. Okay. You come into that organization exactly as you've described. You've got to sit, and I'm going to recap this in case we make a clip. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
You come into a B2B SaaS company with $10 to $25 million in revenue, and they've got a small sales team. They've got some kind of marketing going on. They've got an account management team or a customer success team, and you're coming in as a CRO or someone you're working with is. How do you conduct this audit from day one?
Yeah, sure. No problem. So the first thing I would do, this is kind of wasn't planned, so I want your audience to understand this wasn't planned, but I actually have an audit process that I utilize.
I thought you might.
Okay, yeah, and so the process basically what it does is it determines a numerical score of a health of a revenue operation by asking about 16 questions that are designed to ascertain as a leadership, let's say I'm the CEO of the company, what's my assessment of the way in which my revenue functions operate together? And I'm offline, I'll share it with you. It's actually a pretty cool piece of algorithm, and it's designed to provide a weighted score against these 15 questions. That then the score that results from that assessment essentially is a representation of my own perception of the health of my revenue operation. Okay, and it also provides clarity on, like, let's say, for example, we get the best possible outcome is 100, which means we have a perfectly healthy sales organization. So let's say the example, I take this assessment, then my score is a 60. Not only does it include the number, but it also shows the areas where I see issues. Right? And the idea would be then I would then also give the head of sales the same assessment, same exact questions, to get the head of sales' own score. And then I would do the same thing with the head of marketing or the head of customer success and maybe a couple other people in leadership. And invariably, and I would say this is 99.9% of the time, they obviously don't have the same score. And it's really across the board. I mean, you can see sometimes someone has 100 or a 99, someone has a 30. And this is very revealing, right?
What are some of the things that go into this score?
Yeah. So, for example, things like marketing and sales meet together weekly to discuss outcomes. True or false? Right? That sort of thing. Or sales frequently utilizes the materials that marketing produces and sees value in them. True or false?
Love that.
Right? There's a lot of that stuff, okay? And these are very easy binary questions for anybody to answer. And if they answer them honestly, if they're not trying to hedge the answers, they're going to get an assessment. And the process itself is also really revealing because the questions are ones that a lot of people never ask themselves. They're like, wow, I really actually thought about that question before. It's a good one, And so what ends up happening is the outcome of that initial leadership layer, what it does is it provides the impetus for some insights, right? Because whenever I do this assessment, it's always really eye-opening. Like the leadership's like, wow, Bob had a 30? Really? Bob's score was 30? And mine was an 80? What the hell? I mean, that right away, it's like those two have to talk to each other because I took the same test and your score is that different from mine. Obviously, we have a much different perception of things, which is an indicator that we must be seeing things differently. And there's probably a problem there because it's probably also an indicator that we're leading things differently, right? And so now that becomes the impetus for conversation number one, which is why is the leadership have different assessments and what can we uncover about the way in which we're doing things. And the second assessment is now let's get more people involved. Now let's have like 5 or 6 salespeople take the same assessment. Let's have 5 or 6 marketing people take the assessment. Let's have some people in the customer success organization take the same assessment. Matter of fact, let's even have a couple of customers, right, on board with this, right? Now you get a much wider scope, right, of data, and now the numbers become really compelling because you start to get more information from people who are on the front lines. And as you and I both know very well, Eddie, the people on the front lines assessments are usually really valid because they're the ones that are dealing with this crap every day, right? Mm-hmm. And so the third part is to do interviews. And so what we do is we interview the people who took these assessments and we ask them more qualified questions. Like, why did you answer this way? Like, explain more what you mean when you said this. And, and then we record all that stuff and we put together a much larger, detailed assessment, which provides the organization with an incredible amount of quantitative and qualitative data to show that the world that they're living in is much different than the world that they thought. And now that opens up a possibility for what we can do to solve it. Like, what are the things that we've seen here that clearly aren't working because, people are saying so, and how can we do it again so that maybe down the road, 6 months or a year from now, if we took the same assessment, our scores would be higher and more consistent, right? Because that would be a really good outcome of something being successful, okay? So this assessment is really designed to build a way that it provides a way to kind of take the veil off of things and reveal some, data that gives leadership an ability to see things differently and have goals and gaps identified that they need to address. And those processes then get in the weeds with what you and I would talk about is we need to change our software systems. We need to change our accountability system. We need to change the way that our structure is set up. We need to change the way that we are accountable to X, Y, or Z. Or, you can imagine all the things that come out of this. But it's a very, very, very revealing and very interesting process. And a good CRO would use this process as part of their way of kind of building a coalition around change. So I'm sort of equipping a chief revenue officer with a great tool, right, with which to bring leadership, right, and thinking to the organization. And if the CRO utilizes this methodology, that CRO will distinguish themselves as being someone who made a pretty big impact on the organization, and hence then now gives himself a roadmap with which to be successful. So it's a really, really great way to kind of create an outcome that impacts the entire organization through a higher level strategic thinking sort of a strategy.
Love this. Well, Warren, we're at time. I know you've got a meeting to run to, but thank you so much for taking time to join me today and share all that. We could talk for a few more hours easily.
We could.
But that was
and I
great.
Appreciate this. Thank you. It was really good, Eddie. And again, I really love what you're doing. So thank you so much for asking me to participate.